Imagine a conversation overheard on the streets of Tel Aviv or Haifa in the late 1950s. "Hello, is that really you?" The person addressed would often hurry away without another word. In the tense climate of the Middle East, such encounters were unsettling. Vigilant citizens reported these sightings of supposedly deceased acquaintances returning to the Promised Land. Israel was a nation of immigrants, a place where people could disappear and reappear. Wars had scattered families across the globe, yet these occurrences were becoming too frequent to be mere coincidence. These reports eventually reached the highest levels of Israeli intelligence, landing on the desks of the directors of Mossad and Shin Bet. They were too numerous and too strange to ignore. A pattern began to emerge from the chaos. These were not random resurrections. The individuals reported were almost exclusively members of the Mapai Party, men with combat experience, often loners without families. They were not always powerful figures, but they moved in influential circles. And repeatedly, one name surfaced in connection with them: Israel Beer. To understand the gravity of this situation, one must grasp the context of the Cold War. It was an era defined by a relentless conveyor belt of alliances, arms deals, and ideological battles. For Israel, the question was no longer if its Arab neighbors would acquire Soviet weapons, but when and in what quantity. In this environment, a man emerged whose opinions carried immense weight. By the early 1960s, Israel Beer was a prominent military analyst. Newspapers sought his columns. Ministers invited him to closed-door briefings. Generals and advisors to David Ben-Gurion debated his insights. He spoke with a commander's confidence, dissecting complex military situations with clarity, citing maps, units, and tactics. For a young nation perpetually on alert, he was a vital interpreter of war, a voice of reason and experience. His personal story was a ready-made legend. He claimed to have been born in Vienna, raised among Austrian Social Democrats, and to have fought in the Spanish Civil War as a volunteer with the International Brigades. He said he served in the Ernst Thälmann Battalion under the alias Colonel José Gregorio. This biography of an anti-fascist internationalist, forged in European conflicts before he ever set foot in the Middle East, perfectly explained his bearing and his authority. It fit the ethical code of a generation for whom Europe's struggles were a moral compass. However, every legend remains intact only until someone with the resources to investigate begins asking questions. The more detailed the story, the harder it falls when scrutinized. After his arrest, investigators and historians went straight to the primary sources: rosters of the International Brigades, Thälmann Battalion records, volunteer registration cards. The name Israel Beer, or any of his alleged aliases, was nowhere to be found. While many anonymous soldiers fought in Spain, a man claiming to be a colonel would have left a trace. Furthermore, inquiries with Austrian Social Democratic archives yielded no record of his membership or activity. The paper trail of a life, university records, library cards, civil registries, was also absent. Mossad's checks with Viennese universities and the Verzian Military Academy found no evidence he had studied or graduated as claimed. A doctoral dissertation under his name on the stated topic did not exist. While records can be lost to war, the complete absence of confirmation across all aspects of his European life was a glaring red flag. It seemed the higher he rose in Israeli society, the more elaborate this part of his biography became. The verifiable part of his life began in the fall of 1938, when Beer arrived in Mandatory Palestine. His public story fit a common narrative: escape from Europe, service in the Haganah, and contribution to the new state. He embodied the European rationality and discipline that the fledgling nation craved. By the late 1950s, he was more than a commentator. He was a trusted confidant. He moved seamlessly among journalists, politicians, and officers. Israel Beer ascended to become Deputy Chief of Operations for the Israeli Defense Forces General Staff, personal military advisor to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and had links to Ammon, military intelligence. His political journey saw him shift from the leftist Mapam party to the ruling Mapai, drawing closer to Ben-Gurion, who valued blunt talk. To counterintelligence, however, this profile looked different. A man with extensive contacts, present in all the right places, traveling to Europe, meeting with foreign officials, including the West German intelligence chief. Signals pointed to visits to Eastern Bloc embassies. He was privy to discussions on economic deals, foreign arms purchases, and infrastructure projects where multiple state interests intersected. A puzzle was taking shape. Surveillance intensified on a Soviet diplomat, a press attaché named Viktor Sokolov, identified as a KGB officer. His movements were tracked, revealing a pattern of late meetings and erratic schedules. Then came the confluence of threads. The diplomat was seen meeting with Israel Beer. What followed was textbook counterintelligence. An evening meeting was observed. Beer arrived with a heavy briefcase and left without it. Late that night, the briefcase was back in his hands. For analysts, the conclusion was clear. Documents had been copied. The arrest was swift. Beer's briefcase contained materials that should never have left secure facilities. Lists of military factories, excerpts from Ben-Gurion's notes, various diagrams. These would form the core of the charges. A curious incident occurred during the search. A sheet of paper with Polish text was found. Words like Ben-Gurion, death, and funeral, scribbled without context, caused initial alarm among the arresting officers until senior Mossad officials intervened. The head of Mossad preferred to conduct critical interrogations personally, valuing tone and nuance over written reports. The interrogations were methodical, relying on logic and psychology rather than theatrics. Beer was questioned pointedly about his contacts with diplomats, the nature of their meetings, and the origin of the documents in his possession. He spoke of analytical discussions and informal conversations on international affairs. Evidence from surveillance and financial records was laid before him. His lavish lifestyle, frequent nights at Tel Aviv clubs, substantial spending on women, was inconsistent with his known income. In the end, press accounts indicated he admitted to contacts with Soviet intelligence, but insisted they were friendly relations, rejecting the core espionage charges. His trial in the summer of 1961 was a public spectacle. The emotional press coverage contrasted with the dry, factual tone within professional circles, which focused on evidence and procedure. Beer maintained his calm, confident demeanor, mounting a defense framed in ideological terms. Patriotic motivation, a desire for balance, intellectual exchange. The prosecution built its case on chains of contact, the nature of the seized materials, and the glaring inconsistencies in his life story. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. An appeal resulted in an increased sentence of 15 years. In prison, he wrote a book titled Israel's Security, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, continuing to plead his case to an audience that no longer believed him. He did not serve his full term, dying of a heart attack in the spring of 1966. For Israel's security services, however, this was not the end of the story. High-profile failures often spur reform. Security clearance procedures were tightened, introducing multiple access levels and expanding background checks to include an individual's associates and finances. Internal regulations became stricter. The political fallout was more subtle, leading to a cooling towards circles where ideological flexibility was a hallmark. It became far more difficult to be a public expert while maintaining informal channels with Eastern powers. The balance between open discourse and state security shifted toward caution. Western allies, reading foreign press reports, saw the episode as a sign of the maturity of a young intelligence service. Identifying an internal threat is always more challenging than countering an external one. Cooperation with partner agencies deepened, and the exchange of counterintelligence practices became a priority. Assessing the damage of Beer's espionage, even the presiding judge was reportedly stunned by the indictment's contents. Among the 8 counts were 2 for violating laws on state secrets and 6 for violating state security laws. 2 points stand out. First was his access. While he likely had no direct entry to the nuclear program, he possessed analytical reports, assessments, infrastructure diagrams, procurement lists, and a deep understanding of policy discussions. During the Cold War, this constituted significant damage. The second point was symbolic. When the trusted voice of military analysis becomes a leak, it strikes at the entire system of public trust. It casts doubt not just on one commentator, but on the very mechanisms a society uses to decide whom to believe. We all tend to polish our personal narratives, smoothing edges and burnishing motives. The danger begins when this polished version becomes a key to other people's secrets and decisions. Beer's story is not solely about spying. It is about the seduction of believing one's own myth and the cost paid when that myth shatters. It demonstrates that eloquence, explanatory skill, and persuasiveness do not make a biography true, they make it convenient. So, who was Israel Beer? He was not a hero nor a cartoon villain. He remains the man whose word was accepted for too long, a talented interpreter of conflict, a master of explanation. He remains the owner of a fabricated biography, carefully assembled to suit the needs of his new life. He remains a colonel without a regiment, a metaphor for how persuasive speech can obscure a lack of substance. The security system, in response, chose the unglamorous path of procedure, verification, and doubt. It is less exciting, but it works. In a young state with no time for enchantment, an unspoken rule took hold. If something seems perfect, check it twice. If it still seems perfect, check it a third time. This story is not about a dramatic arrest or a clever duel of wits. It is about institutional maturity, about learning to trust cautiously and verify relentlessly. Viewed over years, this approach seems harsh. Over decades, it proves prudent. This was not the only painful lesson from which Israel would learn. Another epic failure was looming, one that would test the system in a different way. To understand the context of a nation learning through stumbles and recoveries, one must recognize that Israel Beer was not the only internal threat. While Mossad and Shin Bet strengthened procedures and fostered a culture of healthy skepticism, the system was still learning to distinguish discipline from paralysis and control from initiative. Meanwhile, within military intelligence, Ammon, a different logic prevailed, a military mindset, blunt and less concerned with diplomatic nuance. Israel's political landscape was turbulent. Following Ben-Gurion's temporary departure, the more cautious diplomat Moshe Sharett became prime minister. The defense minister was Pinhas Lavon, a man of energy and contention, frequently at odds with the generals. Between them stood figures like the war hero Moshe Dayan and the administratively brilliant Shimon Peres. Against this backdrop, in 1954, an operation was conceived that would later be called the dirtiest chapter in Israeli intelligence. Its official code name was Operation Susanna. Benjamin Ghibli's career began when Israel was emerging from its underground origins. A young officer with a stern demeanor, his name first surfaced in 1948 during the Tuvinsky affair, where an officer wrongly accused of espionage was executed. Tuvinsky was later exonerated, an episode that shocked the young army's conscience. Ghibli emerged from the scandal unscathed. He had followed orders. He rose quickly through Ammon, an agency structured like a military unit, focused on neighboring states and valuing efficiency above all. By 1954, Ghibli was head of military intelligence, a man of action who preferred decisive reports over cautious analysis. This very trait would lead to disaster. It was the summer of 1954. Cairo sweltered under the sun, military bands played, and flags celebrated the revolution that overthrew King Farouk. Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser was not yet president, but was already a national symbol speaking of Arab dignity and independence. Jerusalem watched warily. British troops still stationed at Suez bases acted as a buffer. Then came news from London. Under pressure from Nasser, the British planned to withdraw. Israel saw this as a strategic blow, removing a key intermediary with the Arab world. Concurrently, the United States was promoting the Baghdad Pact, an anti-Soviet regional alliance that excluded Israel entirely. The country felt isolated and vulnerable. Newspapers ran alarmist headlines. Radio shows debated the prospect of war. The defense minister argued with the general staff. Prime Minister Sharat convened an emergency meeting. It ended without clear decisions, but that evening, Lavon set a fatal course in motion. Thus began a story that would transform intelligence from a point of pride into a subject of shameful parliamentary inquiry. This was both his strength and his fatal flaw. After the meeting with Sharat, he summoned Ghibli. Witnesses recall a conversation lasting less than 30 minutes. Lavon was frustrated. "We're losing the region and you're collecting paperwork." Ghibli remained calm. He reported on a network of Egyptian Jews, trained in basic tradecraft, serving as sources on public sentiment in Cairo and Alexandria. The next day, the first notes for what would become Operation Susanna landed on Lavon's desk. In plain language, it meant carrying out minor sabotage attacks on Anglo-American targets and framing them on Egyptian radicals. In Lavon's view, this was an elegant solution. Frightened by the attacks, Britain would slow its withdrawal. The United States would question Nasser's ability to control extremists. Israel would benefit from the ensuing chaos. The operation had one critical flaw. It was prepared entirely outside the chain of political control. Neither the Prime Minister nor the head of Mossad was informed. Responsibility rested solely on two men, the minister and his subordinate. Within Ammon, Ghibli was reportedly eager. This was his chance to prove military intelligence could act independently without Mossad's involvement. He rushed. Preparation took weeks. The operatives were young Egyptian Jews from Alexandria and Cairo, fluent in English and Arabic, recruited under the guise of self-defense classes. One agent later said, "We thought we were doing something important." Egypt's Jewish community in the early 1950s numbered around 80,000, educated, cosmopolitan, many holding British passports. After the revolution, their position grew precarious, with rising suspicions of Zionist sympathies. A small network operated in Alexandria, run by an Ammon case officer named Avri Alad, who posed as a businessman. He would later become one of the story's most controversial figures. The cell included students, engineers, and accountants, the youngest just 19. Their training was rudimentary: basic radio operation, instructions for simple incendiary devices, elementary secrecy protocols. It resembled a hobbyist group more than a professional espionage unit. The first orders came in the spring of 1954. The mission was to execute small arson attacks and explosions at Anglo-American institutions, aiming for maximum publicity with minimal physical damage. The operation commenced in midsummer. On July 2, a post office in Alexandria was targeted. On July 14, attacks followed at American libraries in Cairo and Alexandria. Damage was slight, mostly smoke and panic, but speculation in the Egyptian press blamed Muslim Brotherhood or communists. Israel was not yet suspected. A series of synchronized explosions in cinemas and a train station were planned for July 23, the revolution's anniversary, intended as a finale. One agent, a young technician named Philip Natanson, mishandled a fuse. The bomb exploded in his hands. He survived but was arrested. A search revealed explosives, radio parts, and photographs of his accomplices. Within 48 hours, the entire network was rolled up by swift Egyptian counterintelligence. Documents and radio equipment pointed unmistakably to Israeli military intelligence. When the news reached Jerusalem, the reaction was disbelief. Prime Minister Sharat publicly denounced the Egyptian accusations as a smear campaign against Jews. Within 24 hours, however, Mossad informed him the allegations were dangerously close to the truth. The arrests became an international media event. Egypt presented the case as the dismantling of an Israeli terror network. The trial was a propaganda spectacle. Young men who believed themselves patriots stood in the dock. 2 were sentenced to death. The others received long prison terms. Egypt's Jewish community was devastated by arrests and interrogations, leading to a mass exodus. The Israeli cabinet descended into crisis. No minister could comprehend how such an operation had been launched without the prime minister or the security cabinet's knowledge. Sharat demanded answers. Ghibli claimed he had acted on Lavan's direct orders. Lavan vehemently denied giving any such order. An investigative committee failed to establish the truth. The story was far from over. It merely shifted from Cairo's jail cells to the halls of Israel's parliament. Accounts from that period, both Israeli and Egyptian, agree on one grim detail. The detainees were interrogated with particular brutality. Files mention European specialists, including former Gestapo officers who had found post-war refuge in Egypt. Egyptian counterintelligence archives held records on individuals like Leopold Gleim, the former head of the Warsaw Gestapo, who consulted for local security under the name Al-Nakr. Surviving evidence indicates confessions were extracted under torture. The Egyptian press turned the trial into a show trial. Cairo radio broadcast proceedings live. For the Israelis in the defendant's cage, it was a nightmare. 2 of them, Marcel Ninio and Shmuel Azar, would be executed. 2 others, Robert Dassa and Victor Levi, would commit suicide in prison. The rest served over a decade, released only after the Six-Day War in a prisoner exchange. Notably, a young man named Eli Cohen, later famous as a spy, was detained in connection with the network, but was released when investigators concluded he was merely helping Israeli workers with housing and was unaware of any espionage activities. This fact dispels the later myth of his accidental recruitment from an accounting office. As the global attention on the Cairo trial faded, a storm was brewing in Jerusalem. Mossad, which had been excluded from the operation, conducted its own inquiry. Its findings, presented to the Prime Minister, revealed a truth more damaging than any fiction. Defense Minister Lavon continued to deny any knowledge. Ammon Chief Benjamin Ghibli swore he had received a direct order. There were no written records. It was one man's word against another's. Prime Minister Sharett, reluctant to create a public scandal but unable to stop the avalanche, appointed a special committee under public and political pressure. Its work was cautious, and its conclusions became a textbook example of bureaucratic paralysis. It proved impossible to determine who had given the order, or if an order had been given at all. In human terms, no one was officially blamed, yet everyone suffered. Lavon was forced to resign. Ghibli was recalled from Ammon and sent to a military post in London, a form of diplomatic exile. Yet the affair refused to die. It became a ghost haunting Israeli politics for a decade. When Ben-Gurion returned to power, the dirty business resurfaced. He viewed it as a personal tragedy, a failure of his security system, his army, his officers. He demanded accountability, a full investigation and justice, and was visibly frustrated when his party tried to bury the matter. In 1960, Lavon, feeling betrayed, requested a new inquiry. Ben-Gurion supported it, but with the opposite aim, to prove Lavon's guilt. The new committee again found no conclusive proof. Ben-Gurion, declaring the government unwilling to call a spade, resigned in protest in January 1961. The scandal split the Mapai Party. By 1964, when Lavon was serving as head of the Histadrut Labor Federation, Ben-Gurion demanded a judicial inquiry. The party leadership refused. The old leader then walked out, forming a new party, Rafi, with his supporters. Thus, a botched intelligence operation triggered a political realignment with lasting consequences. The dirty business became synonymous with operational and moral failure. For some, it was a lesson in how ambition destroys discipline. For others, a reminder that catastrophic mistakes can be made with the best intentions. There was a further twist. In 1957, Mossad's internal investigation concluded that a double agent had been operating within the Susanna network. His name was Avri Alad, the same case officer who ran the Alexandria cell. Reports suggest he played a dangerous game, attempting to pose as an intermediary between Cairo and Jerusalem, but ultimately failing both sides. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. By then, trust in military intelligence was shattered. Ammon's influence waned, and its rivalry with Mossad intensified. Tellingly, the meticulous Isser-Harel of Mossad gained greater oversight over all intelligence operations, including military ones. After the debacle, Israel learned to value bureaucratic clarity: who signed, who authorized, who was responsible. Every order now required a signature. After 1961, the Lavon affair entered the Israeli lexicon as a byword for catastrophic incompetence born of backroom dealings. Everyone understood the reference. Ben-Gurion, personally wounded, grew increasingly withdrawn, convinced that military indiscipline and political carelessness had caused the disaster. But the country moved on, facing new wars and new challenges. Within intelligence circles, the affair became a taboo, referenced only by hint. In officer training, it was cited solely as an example of procedural breakdown. Paradoxically, this failure forced Israeli intelligence to mature. It led to the implementation of multi-layered approval processes, strict documentation of orders, and political-level vetting for all operations. Sometimes this led to excessive caution, but it also brought greater safety. Isser later reflected that in intelligence, overconfidence is the greatest enemy, a phrase that became an unspoken motto for generations of agents and analysts. If the Beer case taught Israel to doubt individuals, the Lavon affair taught it to doubt systems. More than half a century has passed. Some Operation Susanna files have been declassified, but key documents remain sealed. There is no definitive answer to who gave the order. Perhaps it no longer matters. The stories of Beer and Lavon are mirror images. In the first, intelligence erred by trusting an ideologue. In the second, it erred by trusting a soldier of action. Israel, having lived through both tragedies, arrived at the necessary conclusion between them. In a world of dangerous neighbors, doubt is the only reliable form of security. If you found this exploration of history and its lessons compelling, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Sharing this content helps us reach more viewers who are interested in these pivotal stories. Thank you for watching. Otto for generations of agents and analysts. If the Beer case taught Israel to doubt individuals, the Lavon affair taught it to doubt systems. More than half a century has passed. Some Operation Susanna files have been declassified, but key documents remain sealed. There is no definitive answer to who gave the order. Perhaps it no longer matters. The stories of Beer and Lavon are mirror images. In the first, intelligence erred by trusting an ideologue. In the second, it erred by trusting a soldier of action. Israel, having lived through both tragedies, arrived at the necessary conclusion between them. In a world of dangerous neighbors, doubt is the only reliable form of security. If you found this exploration of history and its lessons compelling, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Sharing this content helps us reach more viewers who are interested in these pivotal stories. Thank you for watching.